Good morning. I'm Dr. Mark Moyer, the director of the Center for Military and Diplomatic History here at CSIS. We are delighted to host Sir Lawrence Freedman this morning. I see some familiar faces out there as well as some new ones, which is great. And as most of you in this crowd, I think, understand well, the idea of foreseeing the future in principle holds great appeal. So much of what we do in Washington in terms of allocating resources, developing capabilities, and devising strategy is based upon our expectations of the military environment of the future. The trouble, of course, is that prediction is difficult, and some would even say impossible. And in the course of reading this terrific book, I was reminded of a saying by the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu that those who have knowledge do not predict, and those who predict do not have knowledge. Philip Tetlock, the author of the best-selling book Super Forecasting, contends that accurate prediction is not impossible, at least in the short term, but he also emphasizes that humans are extremely gullible when listening to those who claim to know the future. And by simply telling a compelling story with conviction, Tetlock asserts, most anyone can get rich by selling forecasts to corporate executives and government officials. And he laments that when a prediction turns out to be wrong, there is seldom a penalty to pay, as the prediction by then has long been forgotten or has been explained away by the invocation of other factors. But the ability of futurists to peddle new predictions about war without regard for the validity of past predictions has just taken a big hit, thanks to today's featured speaker. And a book on this subject, I think, is long overdue. I'm especially delighted that it's been written by someone of such distinction as today's speaker. The book is entitled The Future of War, A History. It's just been published by Public Affairs. A copy of that is you can see there, but there's also copies that will be available for sale and signing after the event. So I'll now introduce our distinguished speaker. Sir Lawrence Freedman has been Professor of War Studies at King's College London since 1982. And vice principal since 2003. He was educated at Whitley Bay Grammar School and the Universities of Manchester, York, and Oxford. Before joining King's, he held research appointments at Nuffield College, Oxford, IISS, and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1995 and awarded the Commander of the British Empire in 1996, he was appointed official historian of the Falklands Campaign in 1997. Sir Lawrence was awarded the Knight Commander of St. Michael and St. George in 2003. He was appointed in June 2009 to serve as a member of the official inquiry into Britain and the 2003 Iraq War. And following his remarks, he will be joined by Kathleen Hicks, who is the Senior Vice President, Henry A. Kissinger Chair, and Director of the International Security Program at CSIS, and who also previously served in a number of senior positions at the Department of Defense, including Principal Deputy Undersecretary for Policy. So, Sir Lawrence, welcome.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, and thanks very much to CSIS for hosting this. It's a great opportunity, especially as I see some friendly and familiar faces in the audience, so hello. So I don't want to talk too long because I prefer to take questions and talk to Kathy about what's in the book, but let me just try and explain how the book is organized and what I was trying to do. So originally I was going to write a book on the future of war, but I thought it would be quite interesting to start with to just look at how people had done it in the past. So the first chapter was going to be the history of the future of war. And then when I looked at it, I realized first there's an awful lot of books written on the future of war, many of them quite forgettable, probably to their author's relief. But also it was really quite revealing as one looked at these past books, because first you got an insight into the expectations of the time, the assumptions of the time about what really mattered, what motivated leaders and states, how conflict was expected to develop. But also you realize that actually an awful lot of these books were not really about prediction. Sometimes they were, but a lot of the time they were about prescription. They were really saying, if you don't do what I think you should do. This is the mess we're going to get ourselves into. So they were sort of dystopian futures geared to making wise decisions. Just to give a contemporary example of this, you think of two books by Graham Allison. One he wrote in 2004 on nuclear terrorism. Almost inevitable. It really could happen. In the next decade, I forecast it will, unless we do these wise things that I suggest. And then more recently, his book on the Thucydides trap. United States and China are headed for a clash. It's almost inevitable. However, these are wise things that I suggest, and if you do that, then there won't be necessarily a war between the US and China. And it's fine. It's quite an effective, I mean, it does it very effectively. It's a way of getting over a point of view, but it also carries risks because it suggests that a particular set of policies, actions, are going to move you from disaster to stability and hope, whereas in practice the things that make conflicts happen are not necessarily going to be the things that you can anticipate they will be the real levers that make the difference. It can be quite different things. Just again to give an example of things that you wouldn't anticipate causing so much problem. Of all the things that people talked about in 1991 after Desert Storm, probably one of the least controversial was putting a garrison in Saudi Arabia. Yet the consequences of that turned out to be quite fateful, but nobody really paid attention to it at the time. Or even you focus on nuclear terrorism as the great horror, and you can understand why, but you're not then talking about other things which to terrorists may seem much easier to do and more within their competence. So there are risks with that sort of approach. So anyway, that was what interested me about looking back. But it also provides an opportunity to pick up some big themes of the way that we have viewed and thought about war over the last 150 years or so. One of them that really came home to me is the fear of surprise attack, the fear of the bolt from the blue. There's a logic to this. In the 19th century in particular, it was assumed that war was decided by battle, and the aim was to get decisive battle. Well, if you thought that was going to be the case, then you wanted to be better prepared than your opponent. And that largely meant, especially towards the end of the 19th century, mobilizing faster than your opponent, which is what Prussia did in 1870 against France, and what was a big race to the start of the First World War in 1914. So it's understandable that one should think that if war is going to come, you want to start it on the best possible terms. And a lot of the literature on future war, which actually really gets going after the Franco-Prussian War. I open with a book called The Battle of Dorking, which those of you who know England is not a natural place for a battle, especially now. Or with Brexit, who knows? But the Battle of Dorking, it was a book basically about army reform and the need for army reform, but showed how clever Germans might be able to cross the Channel while the Royal Navy was distracted, take out ships through mines. And then there was going to be this battle on a ridge between Guildford and Dorking, which we would fight bravely but lose, which is, you've seen Dunkirk as well. So we'd fight bravely but lose, and that's because we hadn't reformed the army properly. So the literature came in, and this was very much about surprise, this whole literature, and as it developed with other books, spies became important in getting the information upon which the surprise attack could be launched. So the idea of the decisive early blow looms large. With air power, there's the assumption if you get your attack in first, then civilian population will be so alarmed and distressed that they will immediately demand of their government that they capitulate. So that's quite a theme of the interwar literature. And although that's not how the Second World War starts, you see within the Second World War the success of the German surprises, I mean, not first blows, but the way that they moved through France and Holland and Belgium and so on in May 1940, did seem to validate a lot of those assumptions. So then you get in 1941 the two great surprise attacks, Barbarossa, Germany against Soviet Union, and Pearl Harbor. And both of those occasions demonstrate the danger of surprise attack. In both cases, they were pretty well executed. In both cases, they made enormous progress. In neither case did they defeat the opponent. In both cases, the perpetrator was absolutely hammered and shattered as a result of the subsequent war. So you might have thought that that stood as a warning of surprise attack. Yet, if you look at the literature after the Second World War, in this country in particular, it keeps on coming back to Pearl Harbor. So with nuclear, it's a first strike. It's a nuclear first strike that you worry about. And it's notable that Albert Wohlstetter, who is the first to really sort of outline the dangers of a nuclear first strike, his wife Roberta wrote a book on Pearl Harbor. You look forward to cyber, and people talk about the electronic Pearl Harbor and so on. So this idea that the thing most to fear is a knockout blow is very deep-rooted. Whereas in practice, it's not necessarily going to be like that. It can be nasty and unpleasant and awkward and difficult and so on. But first, it may not be this sort of dramatic surprise attack. And secondly, it's unlikely, except in very particular circumstances, that it will be war-winning in itself. So that's one of the themes that comes through. A second theme is, which is really one of the more difficult parts of the book to write. You have all of this thinking about future war between great powers going on merrily, really right up to the end of the Cold War. So in the 80s, you have in my country John Hackett, you have Tom Clancy writing very vivid novels about these big future wars, up to date on the latest technology and so on. Because what nobody's writing about is a surprise peace. That doesn't sell so many books, I guess. So there are interesting questions about why people got caught by surprise by the end of the Soviet Union. But the key point is that nobody had really thought through what was likely to come next. You have one body of literature that's looking for the next war, next big enemy. So you have John Mearsheimer's famous article about Back to the Future, and you're looking at Germany, or you have my almost namesake George Freedman writing about the coming war with Japan. And it really takes quite a while for him to find a way to extract himself from the idea that Japan is going to be the main enemy of the United States in the future as the Japanese economy stagnates. Paul Kennedy, a good friend and somebody I admire, nonetheless managed to get also Japan pretty wrong in his book on the rise and fall of great powers, which is actually one reason why I came to the conclusion that historians should be very careful when predicting and just stick to what they know about. There is that was one response, and that eventually people settle on China as sort of the serious threat that we can all agree has to be looked at with care. But actually what bothered people in the 90s and at the start of this century were civil wars and how we intervened them. There's no literature of any significance prior to 1990, not fiction writers, not even in academia, on civil wars. Academics write about revolutions, because they're quite keen on those, but they don't write about civil wars. And what you see after 1990 is a desperate attempt to catch up with events. And the academics and the policy community are always behind the curve. They're always behind the curve. Eventually, I think after we've really screwed up, they catch up. And so by the time we've screwed up, they understand why we've screwed up and how probably we could have done things better and differently. But it takes an awful long time to get there. So that's, in a sense, the second third of the book is that story of the developing attempt, in which I think a lot of very good work has now been done, to understand intervention and the consequences of intervening, and how, if at all, these things can be made successful, the problems of counterinsurgency and so on. The final third, it looks at these questions of who's next in terms of big threat, but it also tries to address these questions of cyber and autonomous vehicles and so on, the sort of thing that people really want to look at when you're talking about the future of war, which is not really about where wars will come from, but how they will be fought. And there's even been a revival with Peter Singer's and August Cole's book on ghost wars, of the sort of fiction, which is one of the threads through the book, because I think you could, the good fiction writers have been able to imagine things different. I mean, Pete Singer and so on is a think tanker. I always think one of the great advantages if you're in this field and you want to write fiction, it's the only chance you get to write about sex. But there's none of that in this book. It's because you've got to make it sort of a bit racy. But it's good. I mean, it's a way of making, again, an important point. And the point of Ghost Fleet is over-reliance on the most advanced technologies and their particular vulnerabilities. And sometimes there's basic things that matter. And I think that just to conclude, I think, though obviously I try to look a little bit forward, the big issue, the two big issues, I think, and not only about how this new technology will work, but essentially it's one about intervention, whether we still want to intervene, and if we do so on the ground, and if we're not on the ground, with whom are we working and what are their agendas, and are we likely to get caught up in somebody else's agendas because we don't want to shape outcomes. Secondly, nuclear weapons. I mean, nuclear has obviously shifted completely the discussion of future war after 1945, because a lot of the fiction, a lot of the literature was suddenly about either how it could all go terribly wrong, not because of deliberate political decision, but because of malfunction or crazy generals, as in Dr. Strangelove, and so on. Or the aftermath. How would human beings cope with everything destroyed around them, like on the beach? But the fact is that despite expectations, nuclear weapons did have an effect. And the question is, how long does that effect still carry on when a lot of the conditions which were behind the original nuclear deterrents no longer apply? We can talk about that perhaps later on, but obviously we see with North Korea and so on at the moment, we're around. The big issues are still around nuclear questions, now in a proliferation sense. How long will that last? Secondly, alliance. The post-war international order was held together not only because of mutual assured destruction, but because of the durability of the alliance system, which itself was a surprise. NATO has lasted an extraordinarily long time. Nobody would have expected it. Although is the alliance system going to stay in place? Because I can't think of a single event that would unsettle contemporary international politics, the network of alliances to start to be dismantled. So I think that again is a sort of an important, not prediction, but question about the future. And lastly, the last point is, what I try to stress through the book is, if you're talking about war, a lot of books on the future of war, will have pictures of drones and exciting autonomous vehicle with no human beings in sight, it becomes very bloodless and antiseptic. But actually war is bloody and violent, and that always has to be kept in mind. And if you're looking at the future of war, you're as well to look at a continuity of what's been going on in sub-Saharan Africa as you are at some sort of grand clash between the United States and China at some distant point, because that may or may not happen. You can't rule it out. But one thing we can be reasonably sure is that those conflicts that have been going on now for decades, which actually for most people define the experience of war, will carry on, and that they have consequences and impacts that affect millions of people's lives on a regular basis. And we haven't really got very many good ideas about how to stop them. But I'll stop myself at that point, and thanks very much indeed.
Well, as I said to Sir Lawrence before we came out, I read the book and he said, "Oh, did you get to the end?" I said, "Not only did I get to the end, I started at the beginning and went to the end, so I didn't cheat." And there are so many things to pick up in there, several of which you opened with. But let me start with the broadest possible piece, which is if you go from beginning to end, should one leave with a sense that the idea of forecasting is not worthwhile? What should be the takeaway in terms of how we can do better at thinking about war in the future?
It's a good question, and I think, it's the old Eisenhower line about plans are useless, planning's essential. You have to think about it. I mean, you've got to think about the future. You've got to ask questions. You've got to do something. And when you work out what you're going to do, then you're trying to think about consequences and so on. But you have to do it with humility and skepticism. It doesn't mean to say you can't choose. Sometimes you just got to make a choice. But the people who talk with certainty about this can get themselves into trouble, because once you start thinking a certain conflict is inevitable, let's say we assume that a war with North Korea is inevitable, then that has consequences. If you think there are choices, then you act differently. So you can't avoid forecasting. I think there's two pitfalls. One is trend lines, to assume what is, if you've identified a trend line, just to assume it'll continue indefinitely. We may call this the Pinker fallacy, and I start with taking down Steven Pinker's assumptions about decline
of dancing violent conflict.
Yeah, and secondly, the massive disruption. Something utterly transformational is going to happen, and everything that's gone before will be seen as being of a completely different era. And it's really like that either. I mean, I think you have to say that the nuclear weapons moved all conversations to a different level. But the fact is, thereafter, there's plenty of wars that go on that are pretty reminiscent of wars that have gone on in the past. It just means a certain sort of war became less likely.
Mm-hmm. One of the themes, and you talked about it, is on technology, and you have this line, which I think encapsulates it well, on what I would characterize as sort of a tech obsession when one is looking at warfare, and you say it is easier to anticipate the hardware than the politics. Do you think it's as simple, if you will, as that, which is in the human condition to look at that which we think we can put on a trend line and predict, and that's why we focus on the tech? And thus we just need to be, realistic about needing to look at the politics, or do you think there's something more going on there?
Well, it's very striking that from really over the last 40 years, we've had a reasonably good idea where the technology is leading, even before it got there. More precision guidance, Moore's law, and all that. So a lot of the discussion on cyber war gets going in the 1990s. It's not super new in all of that. And you may note that though you know where it's going, it takes longer to get there than you might expect. I mean, we assume these things are going to be in production often earlier than they are. So I think the technology is always worth looking at, always interesting and always important, but it doesn't mandate a form of warfare. And the example I give is precision. So because we have smart weapons now, that if you know what your target is, you can attack it and be pretty sure it's going to be destroyed. We think that means that there's no reason to kill civilians, that we really ought to be able to focus on competence and military targets, maybe in a pinch military related. But the same technology allows you to kill civilians more effectively if that's what you want to do. So if you look at the Russian campaign in Aleppo, which is the best example we've got of another modern air force fighting with modernish sort of weapons, they went for hospitals. And then, of course, technology allows them to deny that. So it's a different, the choices, these choices are political. The technology makes other things possible that weren't possible before. But how you use that technology is a decision. And then, anybody who believes in political prediction just have had to have lived in our two countries for the last 2 years. And, it's a mug's game. So the way that political life develops is full of sort of twists and turns and surprises. It doesn't mean to say you can't see broad trends or how things are going, like the example of, just to wind up, if you take the example of failure to anticipate the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think that would have been extraordinarily difficult, almost irresponsible to have predicted. But what you did need to know that was the Soviet Union was in trouble. There was less excuse for that. There was less excuse for not realizing that the Soviet leadership had to facing some really big choices, and if they didn't address them, then they were into beyond stagnation and steep decline. So you needed to know that, but how it would work out, that depended on all personalities and so on.
That links very much, I think, to the role of social sciences and political science, which take it on the chin a bit. I'm a political scientist, so I noted it. It's a classic debate, I think, to some people, the historian versus the social scientist viewpoint. But in particular, you expend some energy on the failings of a quantitative approach, which is very much the direction that large portions of the international relations community are going. Can you talk a little bit about what you think, where that field is going, how it can get itself out of an alley if you think it's in an alley, and what it can provide to the policymaker?
Yeah, so I think it starts off with two problems, maybe three. The first is the belief that there can be a science of politics. There can't. Just get that idea out of your head. Physics envy, as people call it. There isn't going to be a science of politics. Secondly, the attempt to get a science, somebody once talked about political science as a subject in failing to achieve science avoids politics. You go for what you can measure rather than what may be important. And then when you're talking about interstate wars, there are actually not that many of them. So there's not that many cases. They're separated in geography and time. So there's very few cases and a lot of variables. So it just doesn't work very well. So I think, and then the final problem, I guess, is the data's inadequate. So though you're measuring stuff, and I spent some time on the correlates of war, which, you can't draw large conclusions from this because a lot of the data is just not very good. However, so and I have to say that was a prejudice with which I started, and was thought, once prejudices get confirmed. However, what struck me is that as you move into civil wars, the work gets a lot better. Partly because you've got more cases, there's still a lot of variables, but also because it starts to get combined with field work. People actually go into the countries and find out about it. So that, the methodology, it's on tap rather than on top. It's helping you to make sense, and where there is the data good, use it properly. The databases have improved. But it's no substitute for getting to know the places you're trying to understand and so, understanding some in all their richness. But that's so I think as you move to more hybrid approaches, and I think the best young academics do that now. I think it's much better than some of the earlier, which I would say pretty outlandish claims that were made for political science. Then when you look after all this effort and these claims that this collective effort is going to, which is truly scientific, is going to, Machiavelli had his day, but it's just one guy, the Clausewitz, just one guy, but look what we can do all together. And actually you don't do very much, and you look at the conclusions and they're trite. There's nothing remarkable. Tells them the big conclusion that people came up with, the new law that really could influence policy, which did influence policy, the democratic peace theory, turns out to be completely skew-if, because actually it's generalizing from post-war experience in Western Europe and turning this into a grand theory. And when you start to have countries democratizing in the Balkans, it turns out it doesn't work very well at all. So, I think, again, the argument is for skepticism and care, rather than just, it's not saying throw it all out. But, and as I say, I think the young academics now do a much, much better job in integrating different sorts of approaches.
Acknowledging the complexity.
They acknowledge the complexity,
and
they don't make silly claims about what they're achieving. And they get their hands dirty in the field.
I want to come back on civil wars specifically, but as we move into hybrid, gray area, gray zone, and talking about that whole challenge set, to the extent that you can see it as a phenomenon that is a singular set of challenges, it seems to come very much against the grain of this obsession with the first blow, the decisive blow, the single battle. And that strikes me, that if in fact we have, and you say at the beginning of your book that you're focused on US and British writing in particular, so if we in fact in US and British strategic and future war writing are very much focused on that decisive battle, and yet we have a phenomenon, a class of challenge that's occurring precisely to avoid that. Is that in and of itself a significant problem for us in how we think about warfare?
Well, I mean, it's a problem, but actually it's somewhat better than the alternatives. So the problem, the way that the fascination with critical infrastructure and the idea there's going to be this big cyber attack, and it's as if we've been hit by had a kinetic hit. The plug has gone out and the banks fail and the air traffic control goes down and everything's crashing into each other. Now, that's not if you have to protect critical infrastructure, so you do that because there's all sorts of reasons why there might be little attacks, and it can be from criminal gangs and be all sorts of people. So one point of view, you just have to accept this stuff goes on all the time, and there's a defensive offensive battle, and it goes on. But it's not likely to lead, unless somebody's very lucky indeed, to an electronic Pearl Harbor. What is happening is that you have below the threshold stuff, below the threshold activity, which China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and us, and we do it too, which is a way of sort of signaling displeasure, putting you on your guard. Just know what we can do. What it actually leads to is less clear. What political consequences it has. So take the sort of famous Russian attack on Estonia.
Cyber attack.
Cyber attack on Estonia, which was quite traumatic at the time, leading to Estonia now being the world leader in cyber defenses, doing very well, thank you, on that basis. I think the problem with a lot of these things that don't produce a decisive result is they still have consequences which may not get you to where you want. So you take Ukraine. I mean, the hybrid war was seen to be at play with Russia. Well, first, it's pretty violent. I mean, a lot of people get killed most months, most days. So the violence is very much part of it. the information warfare, the little green men and so on. Well, in the end, what good has it done? At first, it meant that you had a sort of subterfuge for getting people there, but I don't think, nobody serious looking at this had any doubt about who was involved. You look at, say, MH17, the Malaysian airliner. So instead of somebody saying, this was terrible, like the US did when it shot down the Iranian plane in the late 80s. This is an awful thing. We're really sorry, that the problems of warfare, fog of war and so on, we will compensate and so on. They denied it, and they came up with one stupid theory after another, which again brought into being a whole collection of quite brilliant independent civilian analysts who understand how to use Google Earth and Photoshop, have disproved every one of these, and it's still there. The Australians and the Malaysians and the Dutch are still pissed off with the Russians, and an issue that could have been sorted in 2014 is still with us. So I think, again, be skeptical. Recognize what they're trying to do. Recognize it causes us difficulties and may, at times, at least in short term, have advantages. But don't overrate it as if it's a sort of a new bit of strategic brilliance that is always going to catch us flat-footed.
And on Russia in particular, you also, in going through the history of the Cold War, to me it signaled where your thinking was on the issue today, in the sense that you talked about the closed information environment of the Soviet Union and the inability over the long term to maintain a society with that kind of grip of information control. Were you thinking of Putin in part when you and the current debate over Russia's role and internal Russia politics as you wrote that?
Yeah, I think there are enormous continuities from Soviet to Russian thinking. And one of those continuities is a sense of their own vulnerability, which we tend to forget. The direct broadcasting was seen as a threat by the Soviet Union because it threatened this information age. The ability of East Germans to watch West German TV, no doubt undermined the authority of the communist system. The color revolutions are still viewed by Putin and many others as brilliant examples of Western hybrid warfare. Now we may think these, and I think they were popular movements that were opposed to corruption and so on. Undoubtedly we gave them help. And all sorts of conspiracy theories involving George Soros and so on have been peddled as a result of that. So I think you have to start from the fact that the Russians have a sense of their own vulnerability, their own difficulties in keeping information controlled, their own, and that they don't really know their own population, which in the end, I think we know we're less sure we know our own population maybe than we did before, but at least you can talk to the people directly and you hear them, you hear their voices. If you're cutting off those voices, if you're controlling, then you don't know and you get more frightened. So I think there's a continuity there of vulnerability to the sort of information that we provide. What's changed is the ability to manipulate information. And I think we're just starting to get to grips fully with the implications of that. We've had a couple of years of quite staggering abuse of open information systems, of social media, and the use the Russians made of it, and your election and the European elections and so on. And again, I think it's one of these things where we need a bit more perspective, because is this something that is going to be a continuing feature, or are we wiser now?
Yeah.
Are we going to just be much more careful in the future, be less ready to assume, let this stuff spread without trying to counter it and so on. So I don't think we know fully quite how this will work, but it's fine. I mean, it is just a generally disruptive thing. You set this stuff in motion and you can't quite control it. So again, it may well be that the interference in last year's presidential election helped Trump get elected, maybe. But if you're Putin, it's hard to say that this has actually now turned out to work desperately well for Russia, because you still can't control the political consequences of that. The mood in Washington may be more anti-Russian now because the Democrats, who might have been more inclined to sort of make do and mend with Russia, as sort of as in the 2012 election, are now pretty hostile. So, the actual political consequences of this are not self-evident. The activity you can see and watch and worry about, but the consequences are not always what you would expect.
I do want to ask you before I have two more questions before I turn it over to the audience. I want to ask you about fiction. You mentioned a little here throughout the book. You weave in examples, some more accurate than others, if you will, from fiction. And I know you also drew note to current efforts, the project that August Cole has through the Atlantic Council, which is a fiction writing effort. And then you were mentioning you were over yesterday talking to the future war folks at New America, so two other think tanks in town who are thinking through these issues. And of course, Peter Singer is the Ghost Fleet author is over at other Ghost Fleet author is over at New America. So do you think that there is an important role that we ought to be considering on fiction? Do you think there are limits to that in terms of how we use fiction to imagine the next stages of war?
I think that, the great fiction is still caught up with the assumptions of the time. And most of it stays quite close to the present day and just sort of looks a little bit forward. This is what Hackett and Clancy did. But they illuminate issues, and they they make people who don't follow this stuff like we do more aware of issues. So I think I'm all in favour of it. But it is fiction. Arguably all that we do, anybody's looking at the future, describing the future of war, is writing fiction. Because they're all works of imagination. They just happen to have some factual basis, but they're all works of fiction until events turn them into non-fiction. They just do it in a particular and accessible form. What struck me about, I mentioned in the book, the Atlantic project, August Cole's project, is when you read these stories, they're pointing towards a particular sort of modern hero, and they're actually quite classic sorts of heroes, except they're now of either gender, they're now male or female. They're all incredibly smart. They've all been to Ivy League. They're absolutely, whatever they're doing, they're absolutely brilliant and competent, but they're a bit of a rebel as well. They don't like authority, but they're deeply patriotic. It's actually, there's a long line, go back to John Buchan or whatever, of these sorts of heroes. But the violence is not there. They're very techie.
Right.
Because that's what people...
Robots get blown
and
up.
robots get more and more of a role. But the sort of routine violence of contemporary warfare tends to get forgotten. And if people get killed, it's even in a heroic sort of way, as in Ghost Fleet. Whereas, in practice, look at Syria. The everyday experience of war is not that different to the everyday experience that our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and so on would have known. And the way that you're likely to be killed, mortar shells or whatever, is pretty similar too. So I think that's my concern. And there's not many books written like that.
And this is something H.R. McMaster, for example, has written about. Those who, territory still matters, and
territory matters, and people matter.
Fights happen on the land as well as that I think is a good segue to talking about Civil War. I do want to get this quote in from you, which hopefully I can read my own handwriting. But on civil wars and the evolution of even if lagging evolution of thinking in the 1990s and then going all the way to today, I think you can generalize the following to the general contemporary trends of warfare. The guidance that flowed from a norm of non-intervention was absolutely clear. It meant doing nothing everywhere. Guidance for a norm of possible interference was much harder. It meant doing something somewhere. A whole range of possibilities was being opened up without agreed rules or helpful precedents. I think you could extrapolate that well beyond civil wars to just the general way in which we have engagements in a democratic society over the use of force. And I'm wondering if you have a perspective on how we get closer to some kind of way of imagining the utility of warfare or of military action that's appropriate to the violence that it can create.
Well, I mean, ours was a more discretionary. There used to be this distinction which I had something to do with between wars of choice and necessity, and I'm not so, I mean, nobody likes to say that they're in an unnecessary war, and there's always choice, so you have to be a bit careful, but if you've been attacked, you feel you have less choice than if you're wondering whether to get involved in somebody else's quarrel. And I think for the United States, it's a really important issue. It's important for us as well, but for you in particular, because of your alliance obligations. So every time an ally has a problem, you have this question about whether or not you get involved. And it is a choice, but there's always this question mark. If we don't get involved, what implication does that have for the rest of our allies? So that's a very special set of considerations. And we can see at the moment there's all sorts of stuff going on, you know, Iraq against the Kurds, or not yet violent as the Saudis and the Qatar, which in the past would have been the business of the US Foreign State Department to sort out. I mean, that's what they would do. This was sort of bread and butter, but it's not being dealt with. So there is discretion, and you know, obviously Obama was criticized for holding back at a critical moment. Are there criteria? I mean, I was involved in a speech that Blair made in 1999, Chicago speech, which had 5 tests, which also still strike me as being quite good. 1, are we sure of our case? 2, has diplomacy been exhausted? It's a difficult one, that one, but it's there. 3, are the military plausible things that we can do? 4, are we prepared for the long haul? And 5, is it in our national interests? They seem to be still, I mean, you might add others. I think I would add now something, so almost going back to Weinberger's test on public opinion. You know, doing the Iraq inquiry, I was very struck about the problems of going to war without the country behind you. I think they create special issues, as well as we saw with Vietnam as well, poisoning public life in some ways. So, but I don't think that, you know, I think the questions to us, they're considerations. I mean, they're not, you know, it's not a box ticking exercise,
right. but
the questions to ask, and not asking those questions mean that you can sort of drift into things or allow sort of heady rhetoric to overcome you.
Right. All right. We're going to turn it over to the audience to ask questions. When you raise your hand, there'll be a microphone that comes around, and I'd ask that you stand and give your name and an affiliation if you have one. And we're going to start right there's a gentleman right here with his arm still up. Yes, on the aisle. And if you stand, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much, Dr. Freedman. Very interesting. My name is Dimitri. If I have an affiliation, I guess it's unforpeace.org. You can check it out. But I have 2 questions. The first one is about alliances, and I'm just curious, as a military historian, throughout history, have alliances typically been created for one purpose and then split apart, or have they stayed on after, just in the context of NATO, and what your thoughts are on that? And also, how do you think the creation of the United Nations affects our preparation for war and being more prepared, et cetera, and maybe, hopefully, without forcing you to make a prediction about a future of peace? Thank you very much. But also with nuclear weapons in United Nations, I read that you study nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you.
The first question on alliances is a really interesting one. My answer would be that by and large, alliances are temporary. They're put together to meet a particular strategic situation. An alliance formation is normally pretty destabilizing, and therefore NATO is quite unusual. The fact that it's shifted from one original purpose to a slightly different, maybe back now a little bit to the original purpose. But and one of my strong views about NATO is that it doesn't have to do anything; it just has to exist, because it removes this question of alliance formation. You just have to think of what Europe would look like at the moment if NATO didn't exist and everybody was working out with whom they wanted to be allied. And it was incredibly source of instability and insecurity. So that would be the answer to that. I deal with quite the issues of peace in the UN quite a bit in the book, because obviously a lot of the writing on the future of war was to encourage peace. A classic example is H.G. Wells, who wrote about, even introduced the idea of the atomic bomb, because he thought only when after a really horrific war would world government resolve. And you can argue that they wrote this book called The World Set Free that came out just before the First World War, which was about atomic bombs. That's why atomic bombs were called atomic bombs, because of that book. Arguably not by the way he imagined it, because nuclear mutual assured destruction was not world government, but it did actually show people just how horrible war could be and encouraged restraint. On the role of the UN, I mean, it's worth. I mean, Kathy mentioned the sort of phrase about non-interference. The norm of non-intervention comes from the UN Charter. The UN Charter focused on aggression as the crime. Nothing compared to that. It had nice words about human rights and justice and so on. All secondary, because it wasn't going to interfere in the internal affairs of states. All secondary to the crime of aggression. And that's why I think post 1990 international norms changed quite a lot, and the responsibility to protect and all that sort of thing actually is difficult to mesh with the Charter, strictly speaking. And but on the other hand, are we prepared just to watch horrible stuff happening without getting involved? So I think those sort of debates are ongoing, interesting, and important. And again, these things go in waves. So you look at by the late 1990s, early part of this century, you're getting all sorts of claims about the ability to protect and the responsibility to protect being made, and UN peacekeeping being set along that, and they can't do it. I mean, it just becomes too ambitious, and often ends in failure. So, it's a really important part of the debate, which, having sort of gone in one direction, then gone back, and may pick up again. But it is a really important aspect.
Great. Okay. Other questions? Let's go on this side, right to the edge over here.
Peter Pennington, Brit, Royal Navy, once upon a time. My question goes back to the answer you gave about public opinion, and the question is, how do you see what is an apparent rise in the value of the individual in forecasting? By this I mean, 100 years ago, we sent an army into war on a Thursday, and by lunchtime we'd lost 50,000. Now every individual has to be brought home. Families may or may not be written to by heads of state. Mothers sue governments because their children were sent into war with the wrong pair of socks on. The value of the human is rising.
Yeah, and it's I do deal with that. I think the answer is yes. At the moment. So when people are being killed on an industrial scale, in the Somme or whatever, then one individual's death is just lost in the multitude. When you talk about tens of people or even 4 people or whatever being killed, then everyone's a human story. I mean, they're all human stories before, but there's just too much. But once societies start to fall apart or wars get a grip, then it's surprising how regular and routine it becomes. Syria is a pretty striking example of this. And it's interesting, isn't it, the extent to which, when trying to cope with a tragedy like Syria, that actually it's an individual child, their personal story that suddenly grips the attention, because we can't cope with actually trying to think through 100,000 of these children. So we think through just one, and that story hopefully might speak for it all. So, Ed Luttwak wrote this thing about non-heroic war, which I think was based on a false premise that in the 19th century you had so many kids you didn't, you expected to lose 1 or 2 during. There's no suggestion that grief was any less in the 19th century than now. But I think it is the case that we've become much more sensitive as things stand when you're talking about discretionary war, about the casualties. Equally, we're not putting mass armies into the field. I mean, the sorts of numbers that we're talking about are far smaller than would have been considered necessary for quite marginal campaigns in the 19th century or even the 20th century. So, I mean, this is, in terms of how we fight at the moment, we don't expect to fight with mass. We do expect to fight with more firepower and so on, and that does, and we have volunteer armies. So you have to get back to the question of, can we imagine situations in which we're involved that involve mass conscription, mobilization of whole societies and so on. At the moment it's pretty hard to do that, because it's hard to imagine a war lasting long enough to enable us to do that. That's what they fought before 1914, so you can't be sure.
Okay, let's see, how about right here in the front row?
Hi, David Isby, consultant. To follow up on Dr. Hicks' earlier question on the value and function of fiction, have you looked at anything similar with wargaming models and simulation, and whether that could help looking at the future of war?
I copped out on that. I read books, but I don't wargame. I don't do computer games. I did a bit. I mean, I did look at it a bit. And I think it's, if I'm allowed to criticize my own book, it stopped you doing it.
You are allowed. Yes.
I'm allowed to. I think it's something that ought to be. I might have looked at a bit more, but because I think it's been quite influential, not directly, but indirectly, because a lot of the people going to war or in ISIS or whatever have war gamed. I mean, they've done computer games, and there is some work, quite interesting work, which is not always as one might expect, about whether or not people do view what they're doing as just an extension of a computer game. So people who operate drones. This is something that's often said. You're thousands of miles away. But actually, if you talk to people who've done it, and you hear their stories, they don't feel like that at all. I mean, it seems very real to them. So the short answer is not enough. I should have looked at it more, and I think it is important. But I think it's more a question of shifting mindsets, because to the extent I've looked at this stuff, I mean, the scenarios are not subtle. They're not nuanced. I mean, it's wham bam stuff rather than sort of the complexities of conflict, because that's not very exciting to play.
Very good. Okay, we have one right here. And I'm going to bundle this with one other when you're done, so don't answer yet.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Max Kelly with Booz Allen Hamilton. Very much looking forward to reading your book. One note on your mention of modeling and simulations. I did try and weave some of those nuances into a core level war game several years ago, and they were roundly ignored. My question is about the paradigm of warfare and its relationship to politics within our doctrine and organizations. Really, throughout the West, we think very much that there's a linear, or we act as if there's a linear relationship between combat success and political objectives. And despite lots of rhetoric about the complexities, that tends to be the default unstated planning assumption. And it contributes to the mistaking of plans for strategies. So I'm curious if you can comment, and particularly, you know, this has been more acknowledged on the irregular warfare side, but as you've even talked about here, this is also relevant to conventional war and even nuclear confrontations.
Great, and then I want to take one more right here. And then we'll be in time.
Thanks. Rebecca Grant, Iris Independent Research, to the author of The Evolution of Nuclear Strategy. Please comment on North Korea. Play that out for us. What do you see happening next? Thank you.
These things may come together. She's
So,
asking about comment on North Korea and deterrence as the author of eminent works on nuclear strategy. And there we have the question of the military and political domains, if you will, and their intersection.
The difficulty, I mean, it's a really good point, but you know, the Second World War and the First World War ended with the defeat of armies, combat success. But the reasons why the armies were defeated had to do with the exhaustion of the societies, running out of people, running out of supplies, running out of oil, you know, whatever. So the reasons for combat success tend to go broader than just the weaponry and the tactics, especially with wars fought over time. The difficulty we face is with a lot of contemporary conflict is that it's not, or indeed going back to the opening conflict in the book, which is the Franco-Prussian War, is what starts as a conventional conflict turns into an irregular one. And that's what caught the Prussians by surprise in September 1870. They defeated the French brilliantly, classic decisive battle, let's say that. And then the emperor was deposed and the French carried on fighting, and they were at a loss until a Civil War general told them, you've got to be beastly to the population and they'll give up, which they did. But it had long-term consequences. So the problem is the boundaries. And it almost ends there between, it's hard to bound war, hard to contain it between regular or irregular, civil, military, peace war, what's political, what's criminal, and so on. I mean, why are wars sustained? It's because of economic activity a lot of the time that militias start off funding their efforts through crime, and then when they've ceased being sure why they're fighting, they know that the crime is doing pretty well, so they carry on. So I think it's just bounding war. It's not that you can't get battlefield defeats. You do get battle, and they make a big difference, as we can see even in Syria. But it's how then you bring it to the conclusion and say, well, that's it. One side's won, one side's lost, and that's and both sides accept that as the conclusion. That's the difficulty. Well, North Korea. I don't think there's a clever way out of this problem. North Korea has been developing this capability for a long time. It will carry on. It's the only thing it's got. It's got no other asset other than its nuclear missile capability. It offers the world nothing else. Otherwise, it's a pretty wretched place with a failed, weak economy, hungry people, authoritarian system. But it's got news, and for the regime, that's its asset. And so we're not going to take it. They're not going to give it up. And there's absolutely no chance that they will voluntarily become non-nuclear, because they're nothing then. And if you're a potential proliferator, You have Exhibit 1, Libya, and Exhibit 2, Ukraine, and you wonder whether things might have been different for them if they, pursued their nuclear capabilities. So it's not to advocate proliferation, but you can that's why people proliferate. That's why people get the capability. So I don't think there's any way that they're going to get out of the business. I think so the question is, do they see other potential advantages in arising from their nuclear strength? I think they did at one point, but and I think they thought it was a way of extorting money from us as well. But you can only do that, once or twice, then you realise that you're handing over the money, but they're still holding on to their program. So I don't think it works for that much anyway. If you want to fight a preventive war, which the US could do, all that you ask, it's a very big ask, is you think you can control the consequences, which is, potentially the demolition of Seoul, as well as much wider conflict. China, it's just very hard to control something like that once you've started it, and they're clearly thinking that it's possible. The other, I think, a bigger danger, given that this is a pretty belligerent regime which does not want to be seen to be cowed, is an incident that's not particularly a nuclear incident, but a ship being sunk or an aircraft being downed or some activity along the DMZ that creates new tensions, especially when, against the backdrop of current rhetoric. And there's also, there's another danger in all of this, is that North Korean rhetoric hasn't changed that much. He's always declaring war and always making threats, but by and large this tends to get disregarded because it's sort of their, it's actually an old Stalinist problem, because under Stalin the Soviet propaganda was always denouncing sort of the rabid hyenas and using every sort of insult under the book. And when you were really angry, there was nothing left to say because you'd used up every potential bit of invective before that. And that's what the North Koreans do. So it's very hard actually to judge whether they're actually at new levels, just when noticing it, particularly at the moment. So I think it's a dangerous situation, but I think it's dangerous who knows with this administration. But I'd still be surprised if somebody wakes up and says, today's the day. But I do think if there's people get killed, if there's a real incident in which people die, especially if it's Americans, that you could suddenly find yourself in a very, very dangerous situation because, people are just sort of hyped up at the moment. In other circumstances, go back to the Pueblo or whatever, you can cope. But in this, when things are tense, it gets more dangerous.
Sir Lawrence Freedman, thank you for your time. Thank you for the book, The Future of War. There are copies outside the room for sale. And please join me in a round of applause for Sir Lawrence Freedman.